Imagine flying a metal tube packed with bombs, thousands of feet up, surrounded by other metal tubes, knowing that at any moment, enemy planes are going to tear through your formation, guns blazing. But what if that formation, that precise arrangement of planes, was actually your best, maybe your only, hope of survival? What if it was designed to create a literal storm of bullets, aimed at anything that dared to come close? During World War II, the skies over Europe became a brutal battlefield. American heavy bombers, like the iconic B-17 Flying Fortress, were sent deep into enemy territory to cripple Germany's war machine. But these missions were suicidal, without a plan. A strategy to turn these vulnerable giants into a flying fortress in more than just name. The core problem was devastatingly simple. How do you send slow, heavy bombers hundreds of miles into enemy territory, bristling with anti-aircraft guns and swarming with highly skilled fighter pilots, and expect them to come back? In the early days of the war, the idea that bombers could defend themselves was a dangerous fantasy. Bomber crews were facing a grim reality, a constant battle not just against the enemy, but against the biting cold, the lack of oxygen, and the sheer, overwhelming terror of what awaited them. They needed a way to transform individual, vulnerable aircraft into a collective, terrifying force. They needed to make every single German fighter pilot think twice, or even 3 times, before daring to approach. Before the war even began, there was a strong belief, particularly in the United States, that the bomber will always get through. This idea, championed by air power theorists like Billy Mitchell and Julio Dowett, suggested that large formations of bombers, flying at high altitudes, could penetrate enemy airspace and deliver their payload with minimal losses. The sheer speed and altitude of these new flying machines, it was argued, would make them almost untouchable. Furthermore, they believed that the defensive firepower of a bomber, when multiplied by many aircraft in a formation, would be enough to deter any attacking fighters. It was a bold theory, born in an era when aerial combat was still a relatively new concept, and the destructive potential of a coordinated air defense had yet to be fully realized. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its impressive array of machine guns, was the embodiment of this doctrine. Its very name suggested invincibility, a self-defending behemoth capable of shrugging off attacks. When the first models rolled off the production lines, they were indeed formidable for their time. Equipped with multiple .50 caliber machine guns, heavy enough to punch through most fighter aircraft. The idea was simple. If enough bombers flew together, their combined firepower would create a defensive screen so dense that no enemy fighter could possibly survive flying through it. Each bomber would protect its neighbor, creating a deadly, interdependent ecosystem in the sky. But theory and reality often clash, especially in the brutal crucible of war. The early bombing raids in Europe quickly exposed the fatal flaws in this optimistic pre-war thinking. When American bombers first started flying missions over occupied Europe in the summer of 1942, they were often met with stiff resistance. At first, the targets were relatively close to the British coast, and losses, while painful, weren't catastrophic enough to completely shatter the bomber will always get through illusion. However, as the targets moved deeper into Germany, beyond the range of escort fighters, the situation became dire. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was not only highly experienced from years of combat over Europe and the Eastern Front, but also boasted some of the most skilled fighter pilots in the world. They quickly adapted to the new threat. They learned that individual bombers, even B-17s, were vulnerable. A single fighter, if flown with enough skill and determination, could often pick off a straggler or exploit a gap in a loose formation. The German pilots, flying fast and heavily armed Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, were predators in their element, and the American bombers, despite their guns, often felt like slow, lumbering prey. One of the turning points came in the summer and autumn of 1943, with the infamous raids on industrial targets deep within Germany. These missions, like the first raid on Schweinfurt in August and the second, even more devastating, raid in October, became synonymous with the brutal cost of unescorted daylight bombing. These were targets vital to the German war effort, such as ball-bearing factories, which were crucial for nearly every piece of machinery, from tanks to aircraft. The stakes were incredibly high, and so were the losses. On those missions, hundreds of bombers would take off, their crews filled with a mixture of determination and dread. They knew that once they crossed the enemy coast, they would be on their own. The fighter escorts, usually British Spitfires or American P-47 Thunderbolts, simply didn't have the fuel capacity to accompany them all the way to the target and back. So, at a designated point, the escorts would wave goodbye, peel off, and head home, leaving the bombers to face the full fury of the Luftwaffe alone. The German fighters would descend upon the bomber formations like wolves on a flock of sheep. Wave after wave of Bf-109s and FW-190s, often joined by twin-engined heavy fighters like the Bf-110, would tear into the formations. They'd come from every angle, their cannons and machine guns spitting fire, their rockets leaving trails of smoke as they streaked towards the massive aircraft. The sky would fill with tracers, smoke, and the terrifying sight of bombers exploding or spiraling out of control, their wings on fire, their crews often trapped inside. The losses were horrific. On the second Schweinfurt raid, for example, 60 B-17s were shot down out of a force of 291, with many more damaged beyond repair. That meant over 600 highly trained young men were either killed, captured, or severely wounded in a single day. The bomber will always get through doctrine was revealed to be a deadly myth. It became abundantly clear that something drastic had to change, and fast. The vulnerability of individual bombers, even those as heavily armed as the B-17, was undeniable. The answer, the only viable answer at the time, was to refine and perfect the combat box formation. The combat box wasn't a sudden invention. It was an evolution, a desperate improvisation born out of necessity, and the harsh lessons learned in the skies over Europe. The basic idea was to arrange the bombers in such a way that every single aircraft had overlapping fields of fire with its neighbors. This meant that any attacking fighter, no matter where it came from, would instantly find itself flying into a concentrated storm of bullets from multiple .50 caliber machine guns. It was about creating a literally impenetrable wall of lead. Think of it like this. If one bomber has 10 machine guns and it's flying alone, an enemy fighter has 10 guns to worry about. But if you have 20 bombers flying in a tight formation, and they are all positioned just right, that attacking fighter isn't just facing 10 guns. It's facing 50, 100, or even more, all firing at once, all aimed at its general direction. The combat box was designed to maximize this principle of mutual defense. The typical combat box was a highly structured, almost rigid formation. It usually involved a group of 18 or 21 bombers, sometimes more, flying in a staggered three-dimensional arrangement. This group would consist of 3 squadrons, each with 6 or 7 planes. Within each squadron, the planes would fly in flights of 3, often referred to as a V for victory formation. The lead flight would be at a certain altitude, followed by a high flight slightly above and behind, and a low flight slightly below and behind. Then, these 3 squadrons would be arranged relative to each other. The lead squadron would be at the core. A high squadron would fly slightly above and behind the lead, offset to one side. A low squadron would fly slightly below and behind the lead, offset to the other side. This created a kind of stepped pyramid, or a three-dimensional box shape. The precise altitudes and positions were calculated to ensure that the tail gunner of one plane could cover the belly of another. The waist gunners could cover the gaps, and the nose guns could protect the front of the formation. When multiple groups flew together, forming a combat wing, or even an entire division, the scale of this defensive wall became truly immense. Imagine a combat wing, consisting of 3 groups, perhaps 54 to 63 bombers in total. That's a huge block of aircraft, each bristling with between 10 and 13.50 caliber machine guns. Let's do some quick math to understand that 700 machine guns number a B-17 Flying Fortress, depending on its model and modifications. Typically carried anywhere from 10 to 13 M to Browning .50 caliber machine guns. These were located in various positions, a powered top turret behind the cockpit. To waist gun positions, a ball turret underneath the fuselage, a tail gun, and various nose and cheek guns, and later, a chin turret. The B-2 for Liberator had a similar arrangement, often with more powerful turrets. If a single combat group comprised, say, 21 B-17s, and each B-17 had an average of 11 machine guns, that's 231 machine guns in that one group. Now, imagine a formation of 3 such groups, flying together as a combat wing. That's 63 bombers, carrying a total of nearly 700 machine guns. When a German fighter pilot attacked this formation, he wasn't just facing the guns of 1 or 2 planes. He was potentially flying into the intersecting fields of fire from dozens of those guns, all firing at once. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun was a formidable weapon. It fired heavy, armor-piercing, incendiary, or tracer rounds at a rate of 750 to 850 rounds per minute. Each round was capable of tearing through the fuselage and engines of a fighter plane. When dozens of these guns were all firing simultaneously at an approaching fighter, the sheer volume of lead in the air was staggering. It wasn't just a hail of bullets. It was a storm, a wall, a literal cloud of death that an enemy pilot had to somehow fly through to get to his target. The combat box had several advantages. Firstly, the concentrated firepower. This was the primary reason for its existence. Secondly, mutual protection. Each bomber was a link in a chain, and together they were stronger. Thirdly, a degree of psychological deterrence. Seeing such a massive, bristling formation bearing down on them, even the most seasoned Luftwaffe pilots had to think twice. It was a terrifying sight from the ground, and even more so from the cockpit of an attacking fighter. However, the combat box was far from perfect. It was incredibly difficult to maintain, flying hundreds of miles in freezing temperatures, often through thick cloud cover or under attack, while trying to keep a precise station relative to several other aircraft was an immense challenge. Any slight error in throttle, rudder, or elevator could cause a plane to drift out of position, creating a gap in the defensive screen. If a plane was hit by flak or damaged by a fighter, it might struggle to maintain its speed or altitude, forcing it out of the formation and making it an easy target for opportunistic German fighters. Mid-air collisions were also a constant danger, especially during evasive maneuvers or when flying through clouds. The experience of being a bomber crew member in those formations was almost beyond imagination. Missions could last anywhere from 6 to 10 hours, flying at altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet. At these altitudes, the air temperature could drop to -50 degrees Celsius or even colder. Despite heavy flight suits, frostbite was a constant threat. Oxygen masks were mandatory, but even with them, the lack of oxygen could lead to anoxia, causing confusion, impaired judgment, and extreme fatigue. The noise inside the bomber was deafening, the roar of 4 powerful engines, the constant clatter and vibration, the thud of flak bursts, and the rattle of their own machine guns. Communication was difficult, often relying on shouts, hand signals, or the intercom system, which could be unreliable or cut out under pressure. Then there was the flak. Anti-aircraft artillery was a terrifying menace. From the ground, thousands of guns would hurl shells into the sky, exploding into black puffs of smoke, spewing shrapnel in all directions. A direct hit could tear a wing off a bomber, rupture fuel tanks, or kill crew members instantly. Even near misses could rock the plane violently, damage controls, or punch holes through the fuselage. The sight of the black flak bursts, seemingly hanging in the air like deadly cotton balls, was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Crews would often try to ride the flak, hoping to pass through a barrage quickly, but it was a terrifying gamble. But the fighters, the Luftwaffe fighters, were the real nightmare. They were relentless. German pilots would often wait until the bomber formation was deep inside enemy territory, far from any possible escort. Then they would strike. They developed sophisticated tactics to counter the combat box. Initially, German pilots would try to attack from the rear, hoping to exploit the perceived weakness of the tail gunner. However, As the B-17 and B-24 added more tailguns and the combat box became more effective, these attacks became increasingly costly. The Germans quickly realized that the most vulnerable part of a bomber was often its nose or its belly, where defensive fire might be less concentrated, or where the attacking angle was most difficult for the gunners to track. One of the most effective German tactics was the head-on attack. Imagine a fighter, flying at nearly 400 miles per hour, coming directly at a bomber that's also flying at 200 to 250 miles per hour. The closing speed could be over 600 miles per hour. At that speed, the attacking pilot and the bomber's nose gunners had only a few precious seconds to aim and fire before they flashed past each other. This was incredibly dangerous for both sides, but it was a calculated risk for the German pilots. A well-aimed burst from a 20mm or 30mm cannon could incapacitate the pilot or co-pilot, knock out engines, or even cause the bomber to explode. The accuracy required for such an attack was immense, but skilled pilots could make it work. Another tactic involved attacking from below or above, especially from the 6 o'clock low or 12 o'clock high positions, again targeting perceived weak spots. The ball turret gunner in the B-17, suspended precariously under the fuselage, had a terrifying and crucial job, often fending off attacks from below. As the war progressed and the combat box proved its worth, the Luftwaffe adapted further. They began to equip their fighters with heavier armament. Instead of just machine guns, many FW-190s and Bf-109s were modified to carry 20mm or even 30mm cannons. Some, like the Sturmbeck battering rams variant of the FW-190, were heavily armored and designed to fly straight through the bomber formations, absorbing hits while delivering devastating cannon fire. These were flown by pilots, often ordered to ignore other fighters and focus solely on breaking up the bomber formations. They also introduced air-to-air rockets, like the Wurfgranat 21 WFR GR-21. These large, fin-stabilized rockets were fired from tubes mounted under the wings of Bf-109s and FW-190s. The idea was not necessarily to score a direct hit on a bomber, but to explode near the formation, using the massive concussion and shrapnel to break up the tight combat box. If the formation was shattered, individual bombers would become isolated and easy prey for the waiting German fighters. These rockets were particularly terrifying because they allowed the German fighters to attack from a greater distance. Staying outside the immediate range of the bomber's .50 caliber machine guns, the psychological toll on both sides was immense. For the American bomber crews, every mission was a dance with death. They lived with the constant fear of being shot down, of freezing to death, of being burned alive, or of parachuting into enemy territory. The camaraderie among the 10-man crews was intense, a bond forged in shared terror and reliance on each other for survival. They witnessed their friends being blown out of the sky, sometimes in horrific ways, and still had to press on, knowing their turn could be next. The sight of a fellow bomber taking a direct hit, bursting into flames, or breaking apart in mid-air was a common, brutal reality. For the German fighter pilots, facing the combat box was a daunting task. Imagine being a young pilot, perhaps only a few years older than the bomber crews you were attacking, and seeing this massive, unyielding wall of aircraft, all spewing tracer fire at you. The 700 machine guns wasn't just a number. It was a very real, very deadly threat. Flying into that barrage required incredible courage, skill, and often a willingness to accept a high risk of death. Many German pilots described the experience as flying into a flak wall of their own making, a cloud of lead that shredded wings and fuselages. They knew that a single mistake, a moment of hesitation, or an unlucky shot could mean the end. The Luftwaffe's strategy was to inflict unacceptable losses, to make the cost of daylight bombing so high that the Americans would be forced to abandon it. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. After the second Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force, which was the main American bombing force in Europe, had to temporarily scale back its deep penetration raids. The combat box, while effective at concentrating firepower, could only do so much against overwhelming numbers of determined fighters when no long-range escorts were available. It was a defensive measure, designed to survive, not to attack. The solution, the game changer that ultimately broke the back of the Luftwaffe and turned the tide of the air war, was the arrival of truly long-range fighter escorts. For too long, American bombers had been forced to fight their battles alone. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were excellent fighters, but their range was initially limited. They could only go so far before having to turn back, leaving the bombers exposed. The true hero of this story, the aircraft that finally gave the bomber crews a fighting chance, was the North American P-51 Mustang. This sleek, fast, and highly maneuverable fighter, especially when powered by the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, had the range to fly all the way to the target and back, accompanying the bombers every step of the way. With external drop tanks, the P-51 could stay with the bombers for the entire mission, engaging and destroying German fighters as they tried to attack the combat boxes. The arrival of the P-51s in significant numbers in late 1943 and early 1944 completely changed the dynamics of the air war. No longer were the German fighters able to pick their moment, knowing the bombers would eventually be alone. Now, they had to contend with fast, deadly escorts that were not only there to protect the bombers but were also actively hunting them. The strategy of the Allied Fighter Command evolved as well. Initially, fighter escorts were ordered to stay close to the bomber formations, a close escort strategy to provide immediate protection. But as the P-51s proved their dominance, the strategy shifted. Fighter pilots were given more freedom to range ahead, or free hunt, actively seeking out and engaging German fighters before they could even reach the bomber formations. This was a crucial shift. Instead of just reacting to attacks, the Allied fighters went on the offensive, systematically destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. This strategic shift culminated in Big Week in February 1944. Over several days, the Allied air forces launched massive, coordinated bombing raids deep into Germany, specifically targeting German aircraft factories. Crucially, these raids were heavily escorted by hundreds of long-range fighters. The Luftwaffe, forced to respond to protect its vital industries, engaged in massive air battles. The result was catastrophic for the Germans. They lost hundreds of their best pilots and thousands of aircraft, many of which were still under construction. Big Week effectively broke the back of the Luftwaffe as a coherent, effective fighting force. From that point on, they were fighting a losing battle, increasingly unable to defend their skies from the relentless Allied air superiority. The impact of the combat box and the eventual air superiority achieved by the Allies cannot be overstated. While the strategic bombing campaign itself was often controversial and incredibly costly in human lives on both sides, it achieved several critical objectives. Firstly, it forced Germany to divert enormous resources: anti-aircraft guns, fighter aircraft, fuel, and skilled personnel away from the Eastern Front and the ground war against the Allies. These resources were desperately needed elsewhere, but had to be committed to defending the homeland. Secondly, it crippled key German industries, albeit slower and with less precision than initially hoped. Factories were destroyed, transportation networks were disrupted, and the overall war effort was severely hampered. Most importantly, the air superiority achieved by the Allies, first through the desperate ingenuity of the combat box, and then decisively with the arrival of long-range escorts, paved the way for the success of D-Day and the subsequent liberation of Europe. Without air superiority, the Normandy landings would have been far more difficult, if not impossible. Allied ground forces would have faced constant attacks from the Luftwaffe, and their own supply lines would have been vulnerable. The combat box, therefore, was more than just a formation. It was a desperate, ingenious, and ultimately crucial tactical solution born from the crucible of aerial warfare. It was a testament to the courage and resilience of the young men who flew those missions, knowing that their survival depended on maintaining their position in that deadly, defensive block. It was an answer to an existential threat, a way to turn vulnerable bombers into self-defending units, creating that literal wall of 700 machine guns that German pilots had to face. The story of the combat box and the struggles in the skies above Europe is a powerful reminder of the human cost of war. the rapid evolution of technology and tactics, and the incredible bravery displayed by ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. It's a tale of desperate measures, immense sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of air superiority that ultimately helped turn the tide of one of history's most devastating conflicts. These formations, these flying fortresses in their boxes, were not just machines. They were symbols of resolve, each one a testament to the desperate fight for survival and victory in the unforgiving skies of World War II. If you want to understand more about the incredible stories from this period, make sure to subscribe. These formations, these flying fortresses in their boxes, were not just machines. They were symbols of resolve, each one a testament to the desperate fight for survival and victory in the unforgiving skies of World War II. But the story doesn't end with the combat box simply existing. Its success, combined with the arrival of long-range escort fighters, ignited a desperate, brutal, and ultimately decisive struggle that reshaped the entire war. The Luftwaffe, once the proud spearhead of German might, found itself in a death spiral, caught between the relentless pressure of the bomber streams and the increasingly dominant Allied fighter forces. The strategic bombing campaign, which the combat box made viable, placed Germany in an impossible dilemma. Every single day, hundreds of bombers, now protected by an ever-growing swarm of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, pounded targets deep within the Reich. This wasn't just about blowing up factories. It was about systematically dismantling Germany's ability to wage war. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft assembly lines, railway marshalling yards, and even U-boat pens became priority targets. Each successful raid meant less fuel for German tanks and planes, fewer replacement parts for crucial machinery, and a slower, more difficult movement of troops and supplies. For the German leadership, the choice was stark: continue to reinforce the Eastern Front, where the bulk of their army was locked in a brutal struggle against the Soviet Union, or pull vital resources back to defend the homeland from the skies. They chose to defend, a decision that had profound consequences. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns, along with their highly trained crews, were diverted from the front lines to protect German cities and industries. Fighter production, despite being ramped up to unprecedented levels, still couldn't keep pace with the losses. And most critically, the Luftwaffe's most precious asset, its experienced fighter pilots, were being bled dry in a futile attempt to stem the tide. Imagine being a German fighter pilot in early 1944. For years, you had been the hunter, tearing through enemy formations with a sense of superiority. Now, the tables had turned. You were still skilled, still brave, but you were constantly outnumbered. You'd scramble into your Bf-109 or FW-190, often taking off from airfields that had been bombed just hours before, knowing that the sky above was teeming with hundreds of American bombers, each one a flying gun platform, and now hundreds more American fighters, faster and with greater range than your own. The P-51 Mustang, with its laminar flow wing and powerful Merlin engine, was a formidable adversary, capable of outperforming most German fighters at high altitudes, where the bomber formations flew. The German pilots faced a brutal numbers game. For every bomber they managed to shoot down, they might lose one or even two of their own. And while the Allies could replace their pilots with fresh recruits from a vast training pipeline, Germany's reserves were dwindling. The quality of their pilot training suffered drastically. Where once a German pilot might have hundreds of hours of flight time before seeing combat, now new recruits were rushed through abbreviated programs, often sent into battle with barely enough experience to take off and land safely, let alone engage in a dogfight against a seasoned P-51 pilot. This led to a vicious cycle. Inexperienced pilots were easily shot down, further depleting the pool of experienced instructors, leading to even less effective training. The skies became a meat grinder for the Luftwaffe. The big week in February 1944, which we briefly touched upon, was a pivotal moment. This concentrated series of raids targeted Germany's aircraft manufacturing centers. The intent was clear: destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to produce more fighters, thereby cementing Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe was forced to commit its remaining reserves in massive, desperate engagements. The results were catastrophic for them. They lost hundreds of aircraft and, more critically, hundreds of irreplaceable, experienced pilots. Many of these losses occurred not just over the targets, but during the relentless free hunt tactics employed by Allied fighters, who were now actively seeking out German airfields and intercepting fighters before they could even reach the bomber streams. The psychological impact on the German fighter pilots was immense. They watched their comrades fall, day after day, against overwhelming odds. Morale plummeted. They often felt abandoned by their leadership, sent on suicidal missions with little hope of success. Some pilots, in desperation, resorted to ramming tactics, sacrificing their own lives to bring down a single bomber, a grim testament to the hopelessness they felt. These were not acts of cowardice, but rather extreme acts of defiance, born from a desperate conviction that every bomber destroyed was a small victory against an unstoppable tide. On the ground, the impact of the strategic bombing campaign was equally devastating. German cities, once bustling centers of industry and culture, were reduced to rubble. Factories lay in ruins, their machinery twisted and broken. The constant air raid sirens, the frantic dashes to bomb shelters, and the sight of burning buildings became an inescapable part of daily life for the German civilian population. While the primary goal was to cripple industry, the secondary effect was a severe blow to civilian morale, a constant reminder of the war's destructive reach. The systematic destruction of Germany's oil production capacity was perhaps one of the most critical successes of the bombing campaign. Germany relied heavily on synthetic fuel, produced from coal, as it had very limited natural oil reserves. The bombing of these synthetic oil plants, particularly those in the Ruhr and Luna regions, choked off the lifeblood of the German war machine. Without fuel, tanks couldn't move, trucks couldn't deliver supplies, and fighter planes couldn't fly. This fuel shortage became a critical factor in the latter stages of the war, grounding entire squadrons of Luftwaffe aircraft and severely limiting the mobility of the Wehrmacht on both the eastern and western fronts. German General Heinz Guderian famously remarked that the Allied bombing of fuel plants was the decisive blow to the German war effort. The success of the combat box and the subsequent air superiority directly facilitated the Normandy landings on D-Day. June 6, 1944. Leading up to the invasion, Allied bombers and fighters launched a massive interdiction campaign, targeting bridges, railways, roads, and airfields across France. The goal was to isolate the battlefield, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the landing zones and ensuring that the Luftwaffe would be unable to interfere with the landings. On D-Day itself, the skies over the invasion beaches were almost entirely controlled by Allied aircraft. German pilots who dared to show their faces were quickly swatted down. This air cover was absolutely vital for the success of the invasion, protecting the landing troops, providing close air support, and ensuring that the vast Allied armada crossing the English Channel could do so with minimal interference. Without the long, brutal air war that preceded it, without the thousands of sorties flown by bomber crews in their tight combat boxes, and without the ultimate sacrifice of so many, D-Day would have been a far riskier, perhaps even impossible, undertaking. The combat box, initially a desperate measure for survival, had evolved into a tool for strategic dominance, creating the conditions for victory on the ground. The human element throughout this entire saga is staggering. Consider the daily routine for a bomber crew in England. Waking before dawn in a cold Nissen hut, the smell of burnt toast and strong coffee filling the mess hall. The briefing room hushed and tense as the intelligence officers unrolled maps, highlighting the target for the day, deeply into Germany, perhaps Berlin or the Ruhr Valley. The collective groan when the blackboard showed the long winding route, the expected flak concentrations, and the estimated fighter opposition. The walk to the aircraft, the ground crew giving a thumbs up, the climb into the cramped, cold fuselage, the smell of aviation fuel, oil, and sweat. The roar of the engines starting up, one by one, shaking the entire aircraft. The long, agonizing climb into the formation, each pilot meticulously holding his position, knowing that straying even a few yards could have fatal consequences. Once airborne and in formation, the hours stretched on. The cold bit through layers of clothing. Oxygen masks became a second skin. The monotonous drone of the engines was punctuated by the intercom chatter, the occasional warning from a gunner, or the sudden, terrifying lurch of the aircraft from a flak burst. Then came the fighters, a swarm of tiny, deadly specks growing rapidly larger in the distant sky. The call bandits at 12 o'clock high, or fighters at 6 o'clock low, would electrify the crew. Suddenly, the sky was alive with tracers, the thunder of their own .50 calibers, and the desperate shouts of gunners. The plane would shudder from hits. Sometimes an engine would catch fire, or a control cable would snap. The sight of a neighboring bomber, a friend's plane, erupting in a fireball, or spiraling silently to its doom, was a common occurrence, leaving a gaping hole in the formation and an even deeper one in the hearts of the surviving crew. And after hours of this hellish ballet, the long, slow journey home. The relief, mixed with exhaustion and grief, as the English coast appeared below. The gentle touchdown on the runway, the ground crew counting the holes in the fuselage. The hot meal, perhaps a stiff drink, and the quiet debriefing, where they recounted every detail of the mission, every loss, every close call. Then the attempt to sleep, knowing that tomorrow, if they were lucky, they would do it all again. This cycle of fear, combat, relief, and trauma led to what was known as combat fatigue or shell shock, a profound psychological toll that many carried for the rest of their lives. The Luftwaffe pilots, too, lived under immense pressure. Many of them were young men, barely out of their teens, thrown into a war that was increasingly hopeless. Their dedication was absolute, but their resources were dwindling. They faced not only the bombers, but also the formidable Allied escort fighters. They knew that their chances of survival decreased with every mission. Their airfields were constantly being bombed, their supply lines were disrupted, and their fuel was running out. Yet, they continued to fight with incredible bravery, defending their homeland against an overwhelming force. The stories of aces like Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter pilot in history, are testaments to individual skill and courage. But even their extraordinary abilities could not stem the tide of Allied air power. The technological race during this period was also fascinating. As Allied bombers became more resilient and their escorts more capable, Germany desperately sought new ways to counter the threat. This led to the rapid development of jet aircraft, most notably the Messerschmitt Me-262. This revolutionary fighter, capable of speeds far exceeding anything the Allies possessed, offered a glimpse into the future of air combat. Had it been introduced earlier and in greater numbers, it might have posed a serious threat to the bomber streams. However, Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber, combined with persistent fuel shortages, production difficulties, and relentless Allied bombing of factories and airfields, meant that the Me-262 arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a decisive difference. It was a weapon of desperation, a last brilliant flash from a dying air force. Other desperate measures included the Bochum Bar 349 Natter, a vertically launched, rocket-powered interceptor designed for a single suicidal attack on bombers and heavily armored variants of existing fighters. These innovations, while demonstrating remarkable ingenuity, were ultimately futile against the sheer scale and momentum of the Allied air offensive. The impact of the strategic bombing campaign and the air superiority it established extended beyond the European theater, demonstrated the decisive role air power could play in modern warfare, influencing military doctrine for decades to come. The lessons learned in the skies over Germany about bomber formations, fighter escort tactics, electronic warfare, and precision targeting would shape the development of air forces during the Cold War and beyond. The B-52 Stratofortress, the F-86 Sabre, the F-4 Phantom, and countless other aircraft owe a part of their lineage to the experiences of the B-17s, P-51s, and their crews. However, the legacy of strategic bombing also brought with it difficult ethical questions. The immense destruction wrought on German cities, the loss of countless civilian lives, and the psychological scars left on survivors raised profound debates about the morality and effectiveness of such campaigns. These discussions continue to this day, reminding us that even in victory, there are often heavy costs and enduring complexities. The combat box, those tight, bristling formations of American bombers, represents a pivotal chapter in this story. It was a testament to the ingenuity and courage of the men who devised it and, more importantly, the young men who flew within its deadly confines. They faced unimaginable horrors, enduring freezing temperatures, lack of oxygen, relentless flak, and the terrifying assaults of enemy fighters. Yet, they persevered, turning their vulnerable aircraft into a collective force, creating a storm of 700 machine guns that few Luftwaffe pilots dared to challenge head-on. Their tenacity, combined with the eventual supremacy of Allied escort fighters, broke the back of the Luftwaffe, cleared the skies for D-Day, and ultimately played a critical role in bringing about the end of World War II. The skies over Europe, once a canvas for the bomber will always get through fantasy, became the ultimate proving ground for air power, a place where theory met brutal reality, and where the desperate fight for survival forged the tactics and technologies that would define future conflicts. These young men, whether American bomber crews or German fighter pilots, were caught in an aerial maelstrom, each fighting for their lives and for their cause. Their courage and sacrifice, in the face of such overwhelming odds and technological evolution, remain a powerful and enduring part of human history. If you found this deep dive into the air war fascinating, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Their courage and sacrifice in the face of such overwhelming odds and technological evolution remain a powerful and enduring part of human history. But the narrative of the combat box isn't just about the tactics and the aircraft. It's also about the individuals, the small moments of fear, camaraderie, and sheer will that defined their existence. Imagine the perspective of a young navigator huddled over his charts, trying to guide his crew through cloud cover and enemy airspace, knowing that a single miscalculation could lead them far off course, into even greater danger, or worse, directly over a heavily defended target without the protection of the formation. His entire world narrowed to the flickering needle of his compass and the faint radio signals, while outside, the chaos of battle unfolded. He couldn't see the attacking fighters as clearly as the gunners, but he felt every shudder of the plane, heard every burst of machine gun fire, and knew the stakes were life and death. Or think about the ball turret gunner, often the smallest man on the crew, crammed into a cramped, spherical turret beneath the bomber's belly, suspended in space, rotating to track incoming fighters. He was perhaps the most exposed and vulnerable member. His view was panoramic, but terrifying, watching the ground thousands of feet below, the flak bursting all around, and the deadly glint of enemy fighters approaching from below. The isolation in that small metal sphere, the bone-chilling cold, and the constant roar of his twin .50 caliber machine guns firing were his reality for hours on end. He was the guardian of the bomber's underbelly, a crucial role often overlooked but absolutely vital for the survival of the entire formation. The waist gunners, positioned on either side of the fuselage, often stood exposed to the elements, their gloves sometimes frozen to their guns. They had to be constantly vigilant, scanning the skies for any sign of approaching aircraft, ready to swing their guns into action at a moment's notice. The wind howled through their open windows, the cold was intense, and the sheer physicality of manning a heavy machine gun for hours was exhausting. They were often the first to spot incoming attacks from the sides, their shouts over the intercom a critical early warning for the rest of the crew. Their camaraderie was palpable, often sharing a quick joke or a moment of quiet solidarity before the storm inevitably broke. Even the pilot and co-pilot, usually considered the leaders, were subject to immense pressure. They had to maintain the bomber's position in the formation with incredible precision, often for hours, while simultaneously navigating, avoiding flak, and responding to fighter attacks. Their hands were constantly on the controls, their eyes scanning the instrument panel and the chaotic sky outside. The responsibility for the lives of their 9 crewmates rested squarely on their shoulders. They had to be calm under fire, make split-second decisions, and inspire confidence, even when their own hearts pounded with fear. The sheer scale of the logistical effort behind these bombing raids is also a story in itself. It wasn't just about building the planes and training the crews. It was about manufacturing millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, thousands of bombs of various sizes, and vast quantities of aviation fuel. It involved maintaining massive airfields, each capable of housing dozens of heavy bombers and hundreds of personnel. Mechanics worked tirelessly, often in freezing conditions, to repair damaged aircraft, replace engines, and ensure that every plane was ready for its next mission. Armament crews loaded bombs and ammunition, often working through the night, preparing for the next day's sortie. Intelligence officers, meteorologists, and communications specialists all played their part, a vast, intricate machinery working in concert to keep the bombers flying. The weather itself was often as formidable an enemy as the Luftwaffe. Missions were frequently scrubbed due to heavy cloud cover or icing conditions. But sometimes crews would press on, flying blind through thick fog or ice storms that could coat the wings, causing a loss of lift and making it almost impossible to maintain formation. Icing could bring down a bomber just as effectively as a German fighter. The extreme cold at altitude could freeze hydraulic lines, jam machine guns, or cause oxygen systems to malfunction, turning a challenging mission into a deadly one. The psychological warfare waged by both sides also intensified as the war progressed. German propaganda broadcasts would often target American bomber crews directly, detailing the heavy losses and questioning the effectiveness of their efforts, hoping to sow doubt and despair. Conversely, Allied propaganda highlighted German losses, celebrating the destruction of their industries and the bravery of their own airmen. Both sides understood that morale was a critical factor in such a prolonged and brutal conflict. The evolution of the combat box continued even after the introduction of long-range escorts. As German anti-aircraft defenses became more sophisticated and their fighter tactics adapted, the formations themselves were constantly refined. There were debates about optimal spacing, altitude differentials, and the best way to present the most concentrated firepower in every direction. The lessons learned from each mission, often at a terrible cost, were meticulously analyzed and incorporated into future tactics. This constant adaptation was a hallmark of the air war, a deadly chess match played out thousands of feet in the sky. The impact of the combat box and the strategic bombing campaign extended into the post-war era. The sheer devastation wrought on German cities and industries led to massive reconstruction efforts. Reshaping the modern landscape of Europe, the ethical debates surrounding area bombing versus precision bombing, and the targeting of civilian populations, became central to international law and military ethics, influencing future conflicts and the development of international humanitarian norms. The experience of the bomber crews, and the psychological trauma many endured, led to greater understanding and recognition of post-traumatic stress in military personnel. Furthermore, the technological advancements spurred by this aerial arms race laid the groundwork for the jet age and the missile age. The push for faster, higher-flying aircraft, more powerful engines, and more sophisticated weaponry continued unabated. The radar systems developed to detect and track aircraft, the navigation aids used to guide bombers to their targets, and the communication systems that kept crews connected, all saw rapid innovation under the immense pressure of wartime necessity. These technologies found widespread applications in civilian life after the war, from commercial aviation to weather forecasting and air traffic control. The story of the combat box is thus a microcosm of the larger war itself, a tale of adaptation. Immense sacrifice, technological innovation, and the enduring human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. It's a story not just of machines and tactics, but of the young men who flew them, who huddled together in those cold, vibrating metal tubes, facing death from every direction, relying on each other and the collective might of their formation to survive. They were the ones who truly transformed the Flying Fortress from a hopeful name into a terrifying reality for any Luftwaffe pilot who dared to challenge their impenetrable wall of 700 machine guns. Their legacy is etched not only in the annals of military history, but also in the very fabric of the modern world, shaped by the conflicts they fought and the peace they ultimately helped to secure. It's a powerful reminder of what desperate ingenuity and collective courage can achieve, even against the most formidable odds. If this deep dive into the brutal realities of the air war in World War II captured your imagination, be sure to subscribe for more untold stories from history's most pivotal moments. It's a powerful reminder of what desperate ingenuity and collective courage can achieve, even against the most formidable odds. But the story of the combat box and the skies over Europe isn't just about battles won or lost. It's also deeply intertwined with the broader political and strategic context of the war, a context that often put immense pressure on the airmen to perform seemingly impossible feats. Think about the strategic discussions happening far away from the freezing altitudes. Leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, along with their military commanders, were constantly grappling with how to best utilize their resources to defeat Nazi Germany. The debate over daylight precision bombing versus nighttime area bombing was a fierce one, each approach having its proponents and its terrible costs. The Americans, with their heavily armed bombers like the B-17 and B-24, were committed to daylight bombing, believing it offered the best chance of hitting specific industrial targets, thus crippling Germany's war machine more effectively. This commitment, however, placed an enormous burden on the bomber crews, who faced the full fury of the Luftwaffe in broad daylight. The very decision to send these young men deep into enemy territory without adequate fighter escort in the early stages was a calculated risk, born from the belief that the self-defending bomber formation, even without the perfected combat box, would suffice. When that belief proved tragically false, the pressure to find a solution became immense. The losses were not just statistics. They represented a significant drain on trained personnel and expensive aircraft, threatening the viability of the entire bombing campaign. The combat box wasn't just a clever tactical adjustment. It was a desperate strategic necessity, a way to salvage a faltering campaign and justify the immense resources poured into it. The stakes were incredibly high. If the bombing campaign failed, if the losses became unsustainable, the entire Allied strategy for defeating Germany would have to be rethought. This could have meant a longer, bloodier war, perhaps even a different outcome. The success of D-Day, as we discussed, was heavily reliant on air superiority, which in turn depended on the strategic bombing campaign softening up German defenses and drawing away their fighter resources. The bomber crews, flying in their boxers, were not just fighting for their lives. They were fighting to create the conditions for a successful ground invasion, a lifeline for the millions of soldiers who would later storm the beaches of Normandy. The constant tension between the need to hit vital targets and the need to preserve crews and aircraft shaped every aspect of the air war. Commanders had to balance aggressive targeting with acceptable loss rates. Sometimes, the need to strike a critical target, like the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, was deemed so urgent that missions were ordered even when the risks were known to be astronomically high. These were the missions that earned their grim nicknames, like Black Thursday, and became etched in the collective memory of the air forces. The courage of the crews who still flew those missions, knowing the odds were stacked against them, is almost incomprehensible. The experience of being shot down was a lottery of fate. Some crews were lucky enough to bail out over friendly territory, though this was rare. More often, they parachuted into enemy hands, becoming prisoners of war, facing years of captivity. Others were less fortunate, their parachutes failing to open or being strafed by German fighters as they descended. The terrifying moments between the order to bail out and hitting the ground, or being captured, were filled with a primal fear. For those who survived, the mental and physical scars of captivity often lasted a lifetime. Conversely, for the German civilian population, the sight of the bomber streams was one of terror and despair. The rhythmic drone of hundreds of engines growing louder, the wail of air raid sirens, the frantic scramble to shelters, and then the earth-shattering explosions. This was their daily reality. The destruction of their homes, their cities, their way of life, was a constant, brutal reminder of the war. For them, the combat box was not a defensive formation, but a terrifying harbinger of destruction, a symbol of the overwhelming power brought to bear against their nation. This perspective highlights the dual nature of aerial warfare, a strategic tool for one side, a source of immense suffering for the other. The stories of individual heroism and sacrifice are endless. There were instances of bomber crews fighting on with severely damaged aircraft, engines on fire, controls barely responsive, just to get their wounded comrades home. There were gunners who, despite being wounded, refused to leave their posts, continuing to fire at incoming fighters until they collapsed. These acts of extraordinary bravery, often unrecorded or known only to their immediate crewmates, were commonplace in the brutal environment of the air war. They underscore the profound human element that underpinned all the tactics and technology. The legacy of the combat box and the strategic bombing campaign is complex and multifaceted. It was a period of immense suffering and destruction, but also one of incredible innovation, courage, and strategic importance. It demonstrated the power of collective defense, the vital role of air superiority, and the devastating impact of industrial warfare. The men who flew those missions, both Allied and Axis, faced challenges that pushed the limits of human endurance, skill, and courage. Their experiences, etched into history, continue to inform our understanding of warfare, human resilience, and the relentless pursuit of victory. The 700 machine guns in the combat box weren't just a number. They were a symbol of a desperate fight for survival, a wall of defiance against overwhelming odds, and ultimately, a crucial factor in shaping the outcome of the Second World War. This is a chapter of history that truly deserves to be remembered for its profound lessons and the sheer human drama involved. If these stories resonate with you, and you want to delve deeper into the complex narratives of World War II, remember to subscribe for more.